Hey guys, Coach Osborne. I wanted to go over the 1-5 quadratic equations packet and give you guys some tips on homework on how to go through these problems. So I want you to know that as I go through these, I'm going to give you different examples than or what in your packet. So don't copy these in your packet. Otherwise, that's going to be a big fat zero and pretty much be counted as cheating because all you're doing is copying. All right, so use the examples to be able to complete the examples given in the packet. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so let's start with the first one. So when you work through these quadratic problems, you're going to have different methods you're going to be able to use. Now, if you remember, Ms. Menard gave you what she called ZPP, which is basically zero product property. Okay, that's going to be using greatest common factor or trinomial factor. Okay, where she used the box. Or actually, she used the x and the box. Okay, she also used the quadratic formula. She also mentions the square root method, which there was an example, but there's a couple in here that will use that method and we'll talk about it. Okay, so let's first start off with the first one. So every time you approach these, always try to go with the zero product property because usually that's the fastest, the simplest way to handle these. Okay, so I want to bring up my little x. And remember on the top, to set it up, you do your a times your c, so 1 times 15. Okay, then I put my b term on the bottom. And then I'm thinking, what numbers will multiply to give me 15, but then will add up to give me -8. Okay, so well, 3 and 5, right? Or 5 and 3. Okay, so 5 times 3 gives me 15, but 5 plus 3 isn't -8. So that means they both have to be negative. Okay, so now I am going to, sorry for the interruption.
Pictures are going on in the new event.
Okay, sorry about that. So set up my box after I've finished the x. And remember, the first term always goes in the top left. The last term goes in the bottom box. And then you take your numbers that you found, and they go here and here. And always, again, write it with an x. Now, I'm going to first by looking for I got to look for the factors on the outside of the box. And the first thing I'm going to start with is the x squared. Well, I know that x times x gives me x squared. Then x times what gives me -5x. That would just be -5. And then x times -3 gives me -3x. Okay, so now I can write out my binomial factors out over to here to the right. So I take x minus 5 and x minus 3. Okay, and set it equal to 0. Okay, so now again, I want numbers that are going to make this whole thing equal 0. Well, if I plug in +5, 5 minus 5 is 0. And if I plug in +3, that also gives me 0. So there's my two solutions. And just remember that every time you do x squared type of equations, you're going to end up most likely with two solutions, sometimes one if one doesn't work. But after you work out everything, you should end up with two most of the time. Okay, so now let's go to the next one. So now, again, I'm going to try a zero product property. Okay, so I'm going to do 3 times -5, which is -15. It's my a times my c, and then put the b coefficient on the bottom. What two numbers add up to -15 but add up to 4? Well, the only numbers that I know multiply to 15 are 1 and 5, 1 and 15, and 3 and 5.
Students without a class.
So 1 and 15, I can't add or subtract those to get 4. Neither can I do that with 3 or 5. So in other words, this method is just not going to work. Okay, so that means I'm going to skip zero product property, these two, and let's go off to quadratic formula. Okay, so quadratic formula, remember it's x equals -b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all of that over 2 times a. Okay, so now all we got to do is just plug in those coefficients. So first I'm going to start with -b negative times your b. So basically just negative times -4. Okay. And then plus and minus at the same time, plus and minus. -4 squared minus 4 times your a, which is the 3. So remember, notice how every time I'm plugging in a number, I'm putting parentheses. And then times your c, which is -5. Okay, so all that over 2 times your a, which is 3. Okay, so now what's important here is that when you plug in for negative b, you got to realize that's like a -1 in the front of the b. So you got to multiply this negative times whatever number you plug in there. In this case, it's already a -4, so it's going to be negative times negative, so it'll be positive. Okay, now the next thing what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take up my calculator, and I'm going to calculate everything inside of that, which is actually has a funny name. It's called the discriminant. -4 squared, then -4 times 3 times -5. Okay, so that's going to be 76, actually, so I don't need to make this all that big. Okay, so 76 goes in the inside, and then on the bottom, the denominator, I'm going to have 6, 2 times 3. Okay, so now how do I calculate the answer? Okay, well, remember that you're going to both add these two numbers on the top and subtract. That's why it's plus minus. So I'm going to do first 4 plus the square root of 76 over 6. And then I'm going to do the same thing, but just subtract the 2. So 4 minus square root of 76 over 6. And I'll just do that all in here in the calculator. Okay, you could also do this in Desmos if you wanted to. Okay, and actually, if you guys don't have like a nicer calculator at home, and let me just pull up in Desmos, and you want to use the scientific calculator, or I mean, you can go on the graphing calculator as well. The scientific calculator is usually a little easier to use. So you just click up here for Map Tools and click Scientific Calculator, or just Google it, Desmos Scientific. Okay, so what we had again was this. Move this out of the way. Okay, so 4 plus square root of 76 over 6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this a over b function, so I can put a number on the top. A plus square root 76, and then on the bottom put the 6, and there's my answer. And let's round up to the nearest hundredth, so the second number after the decimal, the 1. It's going to round up because we have a 9 here, so it's going to round it up to 2.2. So we'll put the first answer is x equals 2.12. Okay, and then we'll go back and do the same thing, and now we'll all we got to do is change this to minus, and now we get negative 0.8, and there's a 6 here, so that rounds it up to 9. So it'll be 0 or negative 0.79. Okay, so that's how we work with the quadratic formula. We'll end up with a decimal majority of the time. Okay, so now zero product property. Okay, so now again, I'm going to write down a different example here. So we'll have x minus 5 equals 0. Okay, remember zero product property, same thing like up here. So if it's plus 12, then my answer is going to be negative 12. If that's minus 5, then this will be positive 5. Okay, so those are pretty simple. But now when I have a coefficient in front of that x, or a number in front of it, it's a little different. Okay, it's not as easy as just saying, okay, well, negative 12 plus 12. Okay, here, what I'm actually going to do is take that out. Oh, sorry, I'm going to run a different example. So 3x minus 1, and then 2x plus 5 equals 0. And what I'll do is I'm going to take that out and set it equal to 0, because I want to look for what number will make this equal 0. Same thing for the 2x plus 5. Okay, so I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So I get 3x equals 1. And then divide by 3, and so my answer is 1 over 3, 1/3. Same thing here. Here I'll subtract 5, because it's plus. And then I have 2x equals negative 5. Divide 2, and now my answer is negative 5 halves, or negative 5 over 2. So I have x equals 1 over 3, and x equals negative 5 over 2. Okay. So now, looking at this one, again, it's already factored. I don't have to do the zero product property. I just have x. So if I set that equal to 0, well, simply x equals 0. So that one's pretty easy. So if I just have like one term on the outside, it's just going to be x equals 0. Okay, and then on the inside, x plus a, well, negative a is going to give me 0. Okay, so now this one's going to be similar to that, except this time, all I have is 2 terms. I don't have 3 terms up here like this one. It's not factored out. I only have 2 terms, but what I want you to notice is that they both have an x term. They both have x in those terms. So this is a case or I'm going to want to use the GCF method. Okay, or use the box, except just a 1x2 box. Okay, so in the inside, I'll put x squared here, negative 7x here. And again, just like the box up here, x times x gives me x squared. Then x times what gives me negative 7x? So it's negative 7. Okay, so now I've got x times x minus 7 equals, make sure it equals 0. And now if you notice, this looks just like that example up here, and you treat it the same way. So now x equals 0 for that outside term. And then for the inside of the parentheses, it's going to be x equals 7. Okay? So you got to use the box, or in other words, you're doing like a common factor, which is another method, which is similar. Okay, but you're really using the box for these two terms when you just have two x terms. Okay, so now I've got another trinomial. So let's go ahead and try our x. So I get negative, so 1 times negative 24, a times c, b on the bottom. What numbers are going to multiply it to negative 24, add up to 5? Well, let's list it out real quick. So 1 times 24, 2 times 12, 3 times 8, 4 times 6. I'll stop there. Do any of these either add up to negative 5, or could they subtract to be 5? Well, not 1 and 24, not 2 and 12, 3 and 8. Well, yeah, 8 minus 3 is 5. But it's a negative 5, right? So that means that 8 would have to be negative. Okay, now I've got just a 1 in the front, right? So then I can just go straight from x over to the factors. So I get x minus 8 from here, and then x plus 3 from here. It equals 0. And then since it's now the zero product tells me that the first solution would be positive 8, because that's negative, and the second solution would be negative 3, because that's positive. Okay. Okay, so now on this one, let's try that again. Let's also try the x. Okay, so be negative 12. So 3 times, or 8 times c, 3 times negative 4 is negative 12. Take your b term on the bottom. Okay, let's see, do we have two numbers that multiply? 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4. Okay, do any of these add or subtract to 4? Not 1 and 12, 2 and 6. I could do 6 minus 2. Okay, but again, that's negative 4, right? So that means that larger number is going to need to be negative. But now what's different is now I've got a larger coefficient bigger than 1. So again, if it's bigger than 1, I'm going to have to use a box. Okay, and 2x2 box for trinomials. Okay, so the first term goes up here. Okay, then the last term goes here. And then I take those two numbers I found and put an x next to it. Okay, now what's a little different here is that this is 3x squared, right? Not like here where it was like x squared, or here it was x squared. It's got a 3x now. Okay, so I know that 3x times x gives me x squared, but where does the 3 go? Does it go here to the left or to the top? Well, the way I know is that if I look at 3 and 6, the common factor or number that will divide them both is 3. And they both have x. And if I look at the 3 and the 2 going this way to the left and right, the 3 and the 2, there's nothing other than 1 that will divide into x. So it's just 1x, or just x here. And that's how I know. And if you put a 3x here and try to multiply a number here, like 3x times what gives you 2, that's not going to work. You'd have to use a fraction. So then you know that the 3 goes up here. So that's another way of kind of guessing and checking. So 3x times what gives me negative 6? Well, that's 2, but it's negative, so negative 2. And then x times 2 gives me 2x. So now let's write up those factors. 3x plus 2 and x minus 2 equals 0. Okay, so now I'm going to start with the one on the right because it's easier, because it's just x minus 2, so it's positive 2. But this one's not so obvious. 3x plus 2, I'm going to have to solve that by setting it equal to 0, so minus 2. I get 3x equals minus 2, and then divide 3. So it's negative 2 over 3. Okay, it would be my answer. Now I want you to notice something when it comes to factors that have a coefficient in the front, there's a little bit of a shortcut. Now, if I was to just cover up that 3 right there, the answer would be what? -2, because -2 plus 2 it would be 0. And then if I have a coefficient in the front, all I do is take that number and I put it on the bottom. So the last number goes on top, but you got to flip the sign. And the first number goes on the bottom. So the same thing works up here. So if I covered that up and I said, okay, well, 1 minus 1 is 0, so the answer would be 1, or you see it's 1/3. And I have a 3 in the front, so 3 goes on the bottom. And remember, change the sign, so it's negative, it's positive. Okay, so again here, if it's positive, the answer would be negative. If I cover up that first number, it's going to be -5, which goes on the top, and then the first number goes on the bottom. So that's a shortcut that you can use whenever you have numbers right in the front. Okay. Now, this next one, what it's asking you is if the output is 1, okay, how can you determine the input of this function? So not the number you drop in, but the number that comes out is 1, right? So we have to figure out what did you drop in to get that 1. Okay, so let's look at an example that's kind of like that. In this case, here's the function, and then what came out was -8. Well, if I drop in a number and calculate it, it's going to equal -8. So I can just set up an equation. So x squared plus 4x minus 8 equals -8. So if I drop in a number here, I've got to look for a number that's going to give me -8 after I plug it in. Well, now I can just solve the equation once I set it up this way. But if you notice, it's an x squared term here, so that means I got to solve using quadratic methods. Okay, so here, that means that every question that's a quadratic equation needs to be set equal to 0. Notice how they're all that way. These are all set equal to 0. That has to be done that way. Okay, so if I have to have them all equal to 0, well, then it means I need to make this equal to 0 by adding 8 to both sides. So that cancel becomes 0. And notice that that's also -8, and an 8 will also cancel. So then I end up with 0 over here, and x squared plus 4x here. And now I have just an x squared term, and an x term. So just 2, not 3, like a trinomial where we do x. So it's more like this example, where I just have those terms. So I'm going to set up that box. So x squared and 4x. And what I want you to do is find those factors that go up here and then set it up like this, and you find the answer. Okay? All right, so now if I look down here, this looks just like that problem, except this needs to be a w. Okay, so here I'm going to set up that box. W squared, 8w. What multiplies the w squared? Well, that's w times w. And then I want you to finish the problem and write it out. So you'll have w times something inside here equals 0. And then you're going to have to find the solutions. Move this down a little bit. Okay, so then you'll have w equals, remember, that first number will be 0 if it's just a variable by itself. And then you'll have w equals something on the inside once you find it. Okay, now this one's a little bit different. It's very similar. So what we're going to do is set it, because it's still 2 terms. It has a squared term and a non-squared term, but they both have a variable. So we'll still set it up the same way. So 4w squared and 3w squared. Now the term that's in common between a 4 and a 3 is just 1. So w here, but w times 4w gives me 4w squared. And then w times 3 gives me 3w. So now I set it up the same way. So w times 4w plus 3 equals 0. And now I know that that's going to be 0. And now I want you to think about, hey, that looks a lot like what we talked about up here, where you can kind of do that little shortcut, right? So I cover up that 4, and it's positive 3, so the top is -3. X there. X equals. So -3, and then I have a 4 in the front, so I write over 4. And there's my answer. Okay, so now again, let's go back to for this one, remember that everything has to equal 0, right? But it's not equal to 0, so we need to get that term on the other side of the equation, especially because it has a w. So what I want to do is just subtract it from both sides because it's positive. So now I have w squared minus 7w equals 0. And now you can just solve it like you did the other ones here. Okay? Okay, now so we're going to flip to the backside. Okay, so now we have kind of the same types of problems. Again, you need to decide, am I going to use the zero product property? Am I going to use quadratic formula? Or am I going to use the square roots method? Okay, which we'll get to in just a moment. Okay, so this first one, again, I'm going to try the x. So I got negative 40 on top. This is a times c, and then 6 here. What two numbers multiply to 40? Let's see, 1 times 40, but also add up to 6. That's what I'm looking for. 2 times 20, 3 doesn't work. 4 times 10, 5 times 8.
Go on, man.
Okay, so let's see. 1 and 40, nope, that's not going to make 6. 2 and 20, nope. 4 and 10. Well, if I do 10 minus 4, that would work. Okay, so now 10 minus 4, and it's a negative 6, right? So that means the bigger number needs to be negative. Okay, so now I have just 1 in the front, so I can go straight to the factors. X minus 10 and x plus 4 equals 0. Okay, zero product property says that this will be positive 10, and if that's positive 4, this will be negative 4. Okay, so now this one looks a little bit different than the rest, okay, because it's got like x plus 2 in parentheses. Now, if I expanded this out, this would be x plus 2 times x plus 2 equals 49. And what I could do is I could multiply all this out using the FOIL method or the box, and then subtract the 49 from both sides to get it to equal 0. And then I could kind of do all these steps here, like with the x. But I'm going to do something a little different. Okay, if you just have a binomial that's squared, what you can do is use the square root method. I'm going to square root both sides. If I square root this, okay, then this just becomes x plus 3. On this side, square root of 36 is 6. But we have to remember that when we work with these equations, we always get two solutions. So that's because when we square root something, we have both a plus solution and a negative. So we have to write plus minus every time you use the square root method. Always remember that. So plus and minus with square roots. Okay? All right, so now what I got to do here is I got to get x by itself. So I'm going to do minus 3 on both sides. Okay, and now what I end up with is a negative 3 in the front, and then plus and minus 6. Well, if you remember from that quadratic problem, I both have to add the 6 and subtract it to get my solution. So first I'm going to do negative 3 plus 6. Okay, that's going to be positive 3. And then I'm going to do negative 3 minus 6, which would be negative 9. So there's my two solutions. I have x equals 3 and x equals minus 9. Okay, so now let's try that again. Let's try our zero product property here because it's a trinomial. We've got 3 numbers here. So 4 times 3 is 12, and then negative 2 on the bottom. So let's go through our different possibilities here. 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4. Do any of these add or subtract to give me negative 2? Nope, nope, and nope. So that means this method's not going to work for this case. So it's a trinomial, and the only other option is QF, quadratic formula. So what I want you guys to do for this one is set it up, set up your quadratic formula. Now I've got negative 2 here, and remember with the quadratic formula that we have negative b, right? So let's go back to that second problem. We would negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Okay, well, if I have a negative 2, it's going to be negative 2 times that negative, right, in the formula. So I'm just going to kind of skip ahead and put it positive 2. Okay, and then on the inside, it'll be, first it's b squared, so negative 2 squared, which is positive 4. Kind of doing some steps ahead of time. And it's always 4 right here. That number never changes. And then I plug in a 4 times 4, your A, and then times your C. Okay? So now, and actually, I remember now, I wanted this first number to actually be a negative 3. So change that real quick and make that a negative 3. It doesn't help you over here. Doesn't really change anything. That's still not going to work. Okay, and we want that to be negative. Okay, so now that C term is negative, and now we're going to do 2 times your A, which is 4. Okay, so now I'll do the first couple steps here. So 2 plus and minus. Now again, what I can do is I can do all this in my head, or I can do it by hand using the Desmos calculator. So this is going to be 4, and then I'm going to multiply these first. So negative 4 times 4, that's negative 16, times negative 3, that's going to be positive 48. Okay, so basically I'm just adding 4 plus 48 on the inside there, so I get 52. And on the bottom, 2 times 4. And now this is where you need to split it up. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to plug all this into Desmos. Okay, so first, again, hit that A over B button. Okay, and then we're going to do 2 first plus the square root of 52 over 8. Okay, and right away it pops up. So 1.15, we'll do the nearest hundredth. So first 1.15. And then remember, we do the same thing. We just need to change that sign in there to negative. Okay, so negative 0.65. Okay. All right, so now, again, always before you start these problems, most of the time we're going to need to keep it equal to 0. This is the case where I didn't need to be equal to 0 because I had a squared binomial on the left. And if you notice, this is a perfect square. That's why I chose to do square root. Because 49, well, that's square root of 49 is 7, right? I'll let you finish the rest. Square root of 36, that's 6. So that's why that method works. Okay, now this one, that's not the case. I have an x squared term and a separate 3x term. And then another term over here, which means it's a trinomial. So I want this to be equal to 0. So let's add 5 to both sides, meaning that you would add 1 to both sides in that case. Now I have x squared plus 3x plus 5 equals 0. So let's try the x. I got 5 on top, 3 on the bottom. Well, the only option to multiply to 5 is 1 and 5, but I can't add it. I can't get 3 with that. So that's not going to work, so that means I'm going to have to use quadratic formula. So what I want you guys to do is refer to this one for quadratic formula, or go back to page 119, meaning the one before this, to kind of check out to see how to do that, okay? So now let's go down here. Now it says solve each equation. It doesn't tell you how, so that means you can pick what method again. So here, let's try this. So negative 7, and then 2 down here. Well, only numbers that multiply would be 7 and 1. That cannot add to 2. So again, guess what? There's another quadratic formula problem. Okay, so go ahead and apply this method to that problem. Okay, so now this one, very similar to this issue, right? We've got to have it equal to 0. So I've got to subtract that number or take away from that side. So now it's 2x minus 5x minus 4. Okay, so here, let's go ahead and try the x. So first a times your c, it's negative a. And on the bottom, I have negative 5. And let's see, 1 times 8. No, that's not going to work for 5. 2 times 4, that won't work either. So guess what? Another quadratic formula problem. So you can just keep looking at this problem or the one before to be able to solve these three, because those are all quadratic formula type problems, okay? Okay, so another one. Okay, so now let's, again, I'm always going to start with the x. So put a times c up here, 3 down here, and let's see, 1 times 4 and 2 times 2. The only way that'll make that work is with 1 and 4. If I do 4 minus 1 to get 3, but it's a negative, right? So I got to make that one negative. So that works. And remember, that's a 1 right there, right? So I can go straight to the factors. So x minus 4, x plus 1. So we get x equals 4, and x equals negative 1. Okay, so there's a solution. Okay, so again, got to have it equal 0, right? So subtract 5x over here, both sides. That cancels out. Now, the term that I subtracted from both sides, that's the x term, so that should go second, just because we want it in that kind of standard form, and then we put the minus 7. So let's go ahead and try the zero product property. So 3 times 7, a times c, and then negative 5 on the bottom. The numbers that multiply to 21 are 1 times 21, 2, I can't multiply 2, I can multiply 3 times 7. That's it. And none of these add up to 5. So guess what? Quadratic formula. Okay, so there's 4 different problems you're going to be practicing quadratic formula with. Okay. Okay, so this last one on the bottom, or last couple here on the bottom. So this is kind of review, but notice we have a square term this time. So now we're given a function, and it says solve for g of x equals 9. So remember that if you have a number inside the parentheses here, you're going to plug it in to the function. But if it's on the outside, if it's equal to something, that means we're looking for the input. So in this case, if that's the output and I have to look for the input, I need to plug this into here, because notice it says f of x equals 5. So that means I'm basically going to take that number and substitute it for f of x. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to write everything, the function on the left, and then put the output over here to the right. You can put it on the left, it doesn't matter. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead and do it this way. Now, what I told you before is that in this case, we all have to equal 0, right? But what's different about this problem versus this problem now is that on this side, I had an x squared term and an x term, right? And then a constant over here with no x. Now look at this one. I have x squared and then no x here and no x again. So that means I probably want to combine these two. Okay, if you only have an x squared in your equation and no other x term, we want to use the square root method here. Okay, so what I'm going to do to do square root method is I have to get, this is our a term, and this is kind of considered our c term because it doesn't have the x next to it. I want to add this to both sides. Okay, and you'll see why here in a moment. Okay, so now I'm going to add these two together. All right. So now I've got just a single term on both sides. And I can treat this just like any other equation. Like if I didn't have this 2 right there, you just divide 3 to both sides, right? So I'll do the same thing. Okay, so now I have x squared equals 5. But I'm not done because it still says x squared. It doesn't say just x, right? So when it's just x squared, I square root both sides. So I get x squared equals, now if you remember, what did I say? If you square root, that means you're going to have both a positive and a negative solution. What I do is I put plus or minus square root of 5. The other way I can write this is I can put x equals positive square root of 5 and x equals the negative square root of 5. Okay? And if I ask for the decimal, then you would just type out the decimal. You can just go to your calculator and do like the square root of 5. Square root of 5, which is 2.2. That 6 is going to round up to 3 to 4, so 2.24. So x equals, and what I'll do is I'll just write plus and minus 2.24 because they're the same thing. And that counts too. So I can write it this way, or if I ask for the decimal, you could do it this way. You could do like 2.24 and negative 2.24. Okay, so now this is the last one. Pretty much the same thing. We have the given the output. So we're going to set it up equal to that output. Now what's different here, this one compared to that one, is that on the left side we do have 2 x terms now. We have a squared and a single x term. So here we have a trinomial. So here I want to set it equal to 0. So now x squared minus 4x minus 5. And now I want to try first the zero product property. So a times c, which is -5, -4 on the bottom. The only numbers I can multiply to get 5 are 5 and 1. And if I do 5 minus 1, that gives me 4, but that means this has to be negative. And remember, there was just a 1 here, right? So that means I can go straight to the factors of x minus 5 and x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, so I'm going to get x equals 5 and x equals -1. All right, that's it.